I thought I will ring up my wife and say, this is the last call from
300 people, one runway, a plane that touched down and then tried to climb back into the sky with its engines still at idle.
Thomas says he saw the right engine break away and then fire.
It floated over 1/3 of the runway before a warning finally triggered, and still, nobody on board knew what was about to happen. Pilots pressed the go around button. The aircraft began to climb, but the engines never responded. And somehow, every single person survived an incident that should have ended very differently. But this story doesn't end there, because what happened on that runway changed aviation training forever. On August 3rd, 2016, an Emirates Boeing 777 was on a routine flight from Thiruvananthapuram, India, to Dubai. On board were 282 passengers and 18 crew members, representing over 20 nationalities. For Emirates, this was just another normal day. Since its founding in 1985, the airline had built one of the strongest safety records in the world, with no major aircraft loss. But that afternoon, something unexpected happened. As the aircraft approached Dubai, what should have been a standard landing turned into the airline's first ever hull loss. So how does one of the safest airlines in the world end up with an aircraft at the end of a runway, surrounded by flames? To understand that, we have to start with something invisible. Dubai, in August, is known for extreme heat. On that day, temperatures reached around 48 degrees Celsius. The air was heavy, visibility was reduced by dust, and most importantly, a wind shear warning had already been issued. Now, wind shear is one of the most dangerous conditions an aircraft can encounter during landing. In simple terms, it's a sudden change in wind speed or direction over a very short distance. Imagine driving at high speed and suddenly hitting a patch where the road pushes you backward or sideways. That's what wind shear feels like to a pilot. At Dubai, there's another factor: the sea breeze. During the day, the land heats up faster than the sea. Hot air rises over land, and cooler air from the sea rushes in to replace it. This creates an invisible boundary, almost like a wall of shifting wind, right over the runway. On that day, something unusual happened. Both ends of runway 12L were reporting tailwinds at the same time. That means the wind was effectively colliding in the middle of the runway, creating a hidden wind shear zone that instruments couldn't clearly detect. Even more concerning, 2 aircraft ahead of Emirates Flight 521 had already attempted to land and then aborted their approaches due to these conditions. But here's the critical detail. That information, the aborted landings and the wind shear encounters, never reached the crew of Flight 521. So as they began their descent, they were flying into a situation they didn't fully know existed. As Flight 521 approached Dubai, everything initially looked normal. At around 1,000 feet, the autopilot was disengaged, standard procedure for landing. The aircraft was stable. Flaps were set to 30 degrees, increasing lift and control at lower speeds. The planned touchdown speed was 147 knots. But something subtle was changing. The first officer called out a tailwind of 16 knots. That's important, because their operational limit was 15 knots. For a moment, they were slightly above that limit. Then, just as quickly, the wind dropped back to 13 knots. From the cockpit's perspective, things seemed acceptable again. But in reality, the environment was becoming more unstable. As the aircraft descended to about 50 feet above the runway, another critical system behavior came into play. The wind shear alert system automatically disabled. This is actually a standard design feature to prevent unnecessary alerts during the final moments of landing. But in this case, it happened at the exact moment the real wind shear event was beginning. Now the aircraft entered what pilots call the flare, the phase where the nose is gently raised to reduce descent rate before touchdown. But instead of settling onto the runway, the aircraft began to float. It stayed in the air longer than expected, using up valuable runway distance. At the same time, the wind conditions were shifting again, turning into a headwind that increased the aircraft's airspeed. From the cockpit, this felt confusing. The pilots believed they were experiencing rising hot air from the runway surface, a common effect in extreme heat. But it wasn't heat, it was wind shear. And during this float, something very important happened, something the crew didn't notice. The right main landing gear briefly touched the runway. Not once, but twice. It was so subtle that neither pilot realized it. But that brief contact would trigger a chain reaction that made recovery far more difficult. As the aircraft continued floating, a system warning appeared: long landing. This alert activates when an aircraft has passed more than 1/3 of the runway without fully touching down. At that point, the safest decision is usually to go around, to abort the landing and try again. So the captain made the call: go around. He pressed the Turoga button, which stands for takeoff go, around. This system is designed to automatically increase engine power and help the aircraft climb away safely. And initially, everything seemed to work. The nose lifted. The aircraft began to climb. The flaps were adjusted. The landing gear was retracted. There was a hidden problem. Because of that brief, unnoticed wheel contact earlier, the aircraft system had already switched into ground mode. And in this mode, the auto throttle, the system that controls engine power, does not respond to TOG commands. This is intentional. It prevents aircraft from attempting a go around while fully on the ground. But the pilots were not fully aware that this logic applied in their exact situation. So while they believed the engines were increasing power, they were actually still at idle. For 18 seconds, the aircraft climbed with almost no engine thrust. Inside the cockpit, there was no immediate indication that anything was wrong. This is where training plays a crucial role. Neither pilot had ever practiced a go around from below 50 feet, not in simulators, not in real life. It simply wasn't a scenario that was trained. Then came the warning. At around 85 feet, the aircraft signaled that it was losing lift. At that moment, the crew realized something was wrong. They pushed the throttles forward manually, commanding full power. But jet engines don't respond instantly. They take time to spool up, in this case, around 6 seconds. And those 6 seconds made all the difference. Because by then, the aircraft no longer had enough altitude to recover. The aircraft descended back onto the runway with significant force. The right engine separated from the wing. The aircraft slid along the runway surface for about 800 meters before coming to a stop. What followed was a race against time. Passengers and crew began evacuating the aircraft. Out of 10 exits, only 3 were usable. The evacuation took nearly 7 minutes, much longer than the 90-second certification standard. One major reason was something investigators later highlighted. Some passengers attempted to retrieve carry-on luggage before exiting. Despite these challenges, the outcome was remarkable. All 300 people on board survived. 4 crew members sustained serious injuries, but there were no passenger losses. However, the story does include a moment of deep respect. A firefighter, Jassim al-Balushi, lost his life while responding to the situation as the aircraft experienced a sudden internal event several minutes after coming to rest. At the time, the captain and senior cabin crew were still inside, ensuring everyone had evacuated. Now, this information is based on publicly available reports and is shared here purely for educational awareness. In the aftermath, major changes were introduced. Emirates updated its simulator training to include go-arounds from very low altitudes, scenarios that were previously not emphasized. Dubai Air Traffic Control improved communication procedures, ensuring that wind shear reports and aborted landings are clearly shared with incoming aircraft. Training programs also began introducing small, unexpected errors during simulations, forcing pilots to actively monitor systems rather than rely completely on automation. These changes weren't just for one airline. They influenced aviation practices worldwide. Comment also USAN. There's a powerful lesson at the heart of Flight 521. Modern aircraft are incredibly advanced. Automation handles complex tasks with precision and consistency. But the more reliable these systems become, the easier it is to trust them completely. And the harder it becomes to notice the exact moment they stop behaving as expected. Flight 521 was not the result of a single mistake. It was the result of a gap between what the system was designed to do and what the crew expected it to do in a situation they had never practiced. And yet, 300 people walked away safely from that runway. That outcome wasn't luck. It was the result of decades of safety improvements, strong crew coordination, and rapid response on the ground. But the real legacy of this event is what came after. Today, pilots around the world are trained for scenarios that were once considered too unlikely to matter. Because sometimes, the situations nobody prepares for are the ones that matter most.